Welcome to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. On today's show, Dr. Joel Myers and I share the untold story of the Hindenburg disaster and weather's impact on this tragic event. Plus, in our segment, What If? How different would air travel be today if the airship's explosion never happened? And we take an interesting look at the similarities and differences between the Hindenburg and Titanic, the most glamorous ships of their era. It all starts now on Invisible Iceberg. It was the largest man-made object ever to fly. More than 803 feet long, the Hindenburg had completed 62 successful voyages before that fateful day in May of 1937. When it burst into flames, landing at Lakehurst, New Jersey, killing 35 people. Did simple rain clouds bring this feat of German engineering and the age of luxury airship travel to its end? It's one of the fascinating stories in the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History. Joining me to help us delve deeper into the final flight of the Hindenburg is AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers. It was quite a sight. We talked about the length of it, and it actually flew over the two of the biggest cities along the eastern seaboard, and I understand it created quite a stir, but how could it not? Because of the sheer size of the airship.
Yeah, this is before the fateful crash or the fateful destruction of the Hindenburg. So just hours before, it flew over Boston and New York. And keep in mind how large this dirigible was. It was 3 football fields long and about the width of a football field. And it had all types of amenities on board, large cabins and so on. It was literally almost like a floating luxury liner up in the air.
The airship was very well known, was very luxurious, was it not?
Yeah, it was, yeah. And again, as if it was so big, flying over these major cities, people were in awe, getting the chance to see it. And but it was really expensive to fly it, but it crossed the Atlantic 4 times faster than the Titanic, for example.
Let's talk about what happened on the final flight of the Hindenburg. Set it up. How did weather create this disaster?
First of all, it used hydrogen, not helium, which was flammable. And the skin of the Hindenburg was made of a combination of chemicals that actually was flammable. And when it wasn't lightning, people thought for a long time that it was struck by lightning, and that's what set it off. And they now remember, in those days there were no lightning detectors. It
was a little different back then, huh?
Very different. No radar, no weather radar. So you had to avoid thunderstorms and almost play it by ear. And there were thunderstorms around, so they avoided. But they did come through a rain cloud, and the rain cloud charged the Hindenburg. When they dropped the anchor, that's what set off the big spark, and that spark then bursted into flames, and in a matter of seconds, it was completely engulfed in flames and melted. And of course, the most dramatic pictures of that were shown all over the world.
Was this inevitable that eventually, because the way it was built, you talked about the skin, that this was going to eventually happen?
Helium would not have been flammable. But helium was very expensive, and the United States had sort of controlled most of the world's helium and didn't want to give it to Germany because of rising tension. So, and hydrogen is more flammable. So not necessarily.
Is it correct? More people survived.
2/3 of the people survived. Yeah, 2/3 of the people survived. But over 30 people did perish. And of course, what was unusual, why it got so much attention, was the radio announcer, that dramatic, "Oh, the humanity," one of the phrases that people remember for nearly 100 years now.
Terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. 400 or 500 feet into the sky, and it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the flame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. Oh, the humanity.
In those days, there was no television, so radio was much more effective in reaching people. And the other way people got their news really is from in the movies. People went to the movies once a week, and there was always a 15-minute newsreel, which was dramatic, and it was based on pictures and some videos.
How did this tragedy happen to the Hindenburg? The world wants to know, and the highest United States authorities are driving to learn why 2 died at the very instant of landing the world's greatest airship.
People across the country and around the world saw these photos in the movie theaters, bigger than life, and that's what ended that kind of air travel. Just think about it. There were stamps issued by the U.S. Post Office about this kind of travel. There was a lot of interest in it. Now people said, well, that kind of travel is going to come back, or maybe it's good to get into more remote areas that aren't serviced by planes and so on. The problem now is the price of helium is so expensive. The flights of blimps are very expensive.
Thanks, Dr. Joel. We'll speak with you again in a few minutes to run through some of the what-if scenarios related to this tragedy. Here with more perspective on the Hindenburg tragedy is Thomas Payon with the National Air and Space Museum. Thomas, thanks again for joining us here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
What was luxury travel by airship like in the early to mid-1930s, and who were the passengers?
Up to this point, even some of your fastest ships, it would take 5 to 10 days to cross the Atlantic. Airships like the Hindenburg, you could fly in 2.5 days. And even then, some of the flights were quicker than that, depending on winds and other factors like that. It also was unique in that the perspectives it offered. The airship had a passenger car that hung under it, and there were berths for sleeping, there were lounges, there was a dining room, there were windows that passengers could look at the sea below as they traveled. It was just something completely different. And it was very much built for kind of a luxurious travel. They even had a specially built aluminum piano, which was lighter weight, so that it could be in one of the lounges. During the seasons that it flew, tickets at the time were $400 to $450. Which in today's currency is almost $10,000, give or take.
Where and how many voyages had the Hindenburg safely taken before the disaster?
So the disaster occurred on its 63rd flight. The Hindenburg had only launched kind of service the year before in 1936. It had taken 4 years to construct, and they had, launched it after some test flights. So it had its season. It flew several, flights in 1936, and then 1937 was when it was lost. It was on its 63rd flight.
Was a disaster like the Hindenburg just inevitable due to the dirigibles?
I don't think it's fair to say inevitable. However, the airships were very susceptible to weather. The U.S. Navy had built several airships in this era as well. And one of its first airships, the first airship the U.S. Navy built was the USS Shenandoah. And it was lost over Ohio in a very strong thunderstorm that basically tore it apart.
One of my lasting memories as a child was when I saw that picture of the Hindenburg and I saw it engulfed in flames, and in my mind thinking, wow, no one could survive this, but yet some passengers did survive this horrific fire and crash.
The fire traveled very fast. I mean, the fireball you see in the kind of famous newsreels and whatnot it caught fire and burned in about a minute. So it was a very fast traveling fire. And as it was traveling, it also was getting closer and closer to the ground. And a lot of the people that survived were those that were close to windows or exits and actually jumped out of the airship as it approached the ground. Many of those that perished were deeper in the airship or in areas that they could not escape the fire as it burned. But a majority did survive. 62 of the 97 people aboard did survive the crash.
As flames started coming through, The only course open for anybody was to make a jump out of the windows.
Now, in 1933, the U.S. Navy's U.S. Akron military airship was wrecked. How was this disaster different?
Part of it was the fact that it was a military craft as opposed to a civilian craft. So with the military, there's kind of some more inevitable risk. So that was a little bit different, the fact that it was military. It also broke up off the coast of New Jersey in a very bad thunderstorm, and the most of the crew that perished actually drowned. They had not been issued life jackets and had not been issued life rafts or anything of the sort. So it was really that location over the water and the lack of kind of any flotation devices that really made the Akron so much more deadly than the Hindenburg crash.
Thomas Payon with the National Air and Space Museum, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Invisible Iceberg returns after a quick break. Welcome back to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. It's time for our segment, What If?, where we take a look at the events surrounding the Hindenburg disaster that may have changed the course of air travel. Joining him again is AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers. Before we get into the what if, let's talk about the media at that time. I mean, today you have so many different forms, internet, radio, television. Little different back in the 1930s, was it not?
It was. This is nearly 90 years ago, and newspapers were the main source of news. And in fact, many newspapers gave updates morning, noon, and in the evening. A lot of newspapers were evening newspapers, whereas today they're morning. And so that's how people depended on getting their news. And there were few pictures, grainy and so on, but that was it. There was no television. The movies had a newsreel once a week. It was updated. And radio was coming along, and radio was the only way you could get anything in real time.
In fact, it was that radio broadcast that really set the scene, right? The term, oh, the humanity of it. That really sent shockwaves across the country, didn't it?
It did. Even very few people were actually listening, but of course they recorded it, and it got replayed a lot, and it got replayed in the newsreels people saw in the theaters, along with the photos. I guess they were just two simultaneous photos of the Hindenburg disaster.
Now, over the years, there have been many airplane crashes. We've seen them, yet none of them halted the production of airlines. So why did it bring an end to the airship? And what if there was less coverage? You think that would have changed anything?
Well, it may have. Certainly, there are a lot of reasons why the airships didn't continue. Clearly, hydrogen is flammable, but fuel is flammable. But it was how it was done. But I think it was mainly the dramatic impact of this disaster and how it affected people's thinking. Airplanes much more flexible, and it just was practicality, but also helium, which would have been a safer fuel, was not readily available, and it became more expensive, and so there are a lot of other reasons too. But initially, people didn't want to fly on blimps anymore, and so it really changed everything. And then there's been talk since then every couple of years about blimps coming back. And of course, we have the Goodyear blimp and a few others, but there are a lot of reasons why it just didn't come back.
When you were researching the book, it must have been something where these great airships were the envy. And then just like that, it just changed on a dime. Did it?
It did. They were expensive even then, but yes, obviously cost was a factor.
Let's talk about hydrogen, and how did the Hindenburg disaster affect the use of hydrogen as a fuel? It had a huge impact.
Yes, well, it's flammable, and of course, but if the skin of the Hindenburg had not been so flammable, it might not have happened. It probably wouldn't have happened. But it was a combination of hydrogen as a fuel, combined with foolishly what they made the skin of the Hindenburg out of that was also flammable. And of course, with sparks or even shorter lightning, you still get a charge. It was very susceptible to being ignited.
Well, I'm going to ask a pretty difficult question of you. I know you have an answer, though. Do you think if the Hindenburg didn't happen, if that disaster didn't happen, that those great airships that were the size that they were and the envy of that time, do you think that obviously they changed? Do you think we'd still be flying them today?
I don't know if we'd still be flying them today, but certainly it would have gone on a lot longer, and it would have grown, I'm sure, and they probably would have been used too for reconnaissance in World War II. It had a big impact on that whole industry.
On that whole industry, yeah. Let's talk about this. Do you think we have all of the changes now? There's more safety. Do you think those great airships have any role today? And if we were still flying them, what role would they have in today's society? We have so many planes, and I mean, would it be more tactical, or would it still be like transportation?
Well, you can imagine a lot of remote communities or places that aren't really served well by commercial aviation. It could be a way of transporting people from main airports to connection flights and things like that. But I doubt that era has passed. We now have drones that are coming, and it's commercial aviation is much more efficient and much safer. I mean, 30, 40 years ago, there was an aircraft crash at least once a month. Yeah. People took it for granted. You're taking a risk when you're flying, just like when you get in your car, there's a risk. But now there's hardly any ever commercial aviation fatal crashes. So it's a different world today, and drones coming, I think that ship has sailed.
And even from a cost-effective standpoint, right? What was the cost back then? Do you remember you were talking about how much it would cost to fly those?
Today, it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars just in fuel to travel from Europe to the United States, like the Hindenburg did.
I want to thank AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book, Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History. Dr. Joel Myers, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Joel.
My pleasure, Bernie.
They were the fastest and largest ships of their time, and their tragedy shocked the world. Up next, we look at the similarities and differences between the Hindenburg and Titanic. Welcome back to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. Although their fatal voyages were 25 years apart, both the Titanic and the Hindenburg are forever linked. Two passenger ships, one in the sea and one in the air, each destroyed in deadly disasters. Both ships were more than 800 feet long, and both were humbled by the weather. But there were differences between them. While the Titanic sunk on its maiden voyage in 1912, the Hindenburg had many successful flights. 62 voyages from Europe to North and South America were completed before the airship's explosive end in 1937. The tragic death toll of both ships was also very different. The Titanic had 2,500 passengers aboard, and more than 1,500, or nearly 70% of them, died. The Hindenburg had 35 deaths among the 97 passengers and crew. That's 36%. Many survivors suffered burns but were able to escape. The Titanic was built for luxury. The Hindenburg was built for speed. The Titanic had much more available space for passengers. The Hindenburg had 25 private windowless cabins in the interior of the airship, but it also featured a cocktail lounge, a restaurant, and observation promenades on both sides. Most surprising was a smoking room, sealed and pressurized. But the main difference was the speed of travel. While the cruise ship took about 5 days to cross the Atlantic, the Hindenburg could do it in 2 days. The fastest crossing was just 43 hours. But the Hindenburg's era of passenger air travel by airship ended that tragic day in New Jersey. I want to thank AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers, for joining us today. And we thank you for watching as well. We'll see you next time.